So it's time for my Epiphany broadcast, and it's going to be short because basically what I sort of want to leave you with is just a couple of questions, really. You know, I've spoken a lot about different things to do with the Epiphany in past years. You know, the Magi, the gifts, you know, the fact the Magi were astrologers, the actual happening of the Epiphany versus what the church generally tends to teach. I've done all that. So what I want to think about now is a character that was there, present all the way through the Nativity, and is usually pretty much missed out. Joseph. Joseph was the foster father, I suppose you would call him. He was the person who was engaged to be married to Mary at the time that Jesus was born. He subsequently did, I assume, but he is quite absent, really, in much of the scripture. There isn't much that we know about him. We know what his occupation was. He was a carpenter, a constructor, basically. And it's interesting that Christ would be born into a family like that because, of course, God's sort of major thing, if you like, is creation. It's creating things. So to be making things, you know, out of blocks of wood into, you know, physical forms that can be used for things, not really a surprise. What might be a surprise to you is that the Roman Church generally tend to think that Joseph died probably rather early in Jesus' life. You know, apparently there's no mention of him after the coming of age of Christ, basically. So any time from about 12 or 13 years onwards, we don't know whether Joseph was there or not. And certainly by the time you get to Christ being around the age of 30, and you're starting to see, you know, the teachings and the passion and the death and all that thing, there's no mention of him at all. And you would have thought that if he had been around, there would be, because there's plenty of mentioning about Mary. And I think, you know, in certain ways, because she's mentioned more, a huge deal has been made out of her, which, in a sense, and I've said this before in other broadcasts, is a bit of a pity, because one of the nice things about Mary for me is the fact that she wasn't special. She was simply somebody who permitted God's will to be done at whatever expense it cost her personally or, you know, privately. It wasn't an issue, and that, I suppose, is why she should be honoured rather than, you know, all the titles that they bestow on her, which are weird, like, you know, Queen of Heaven. Well, she can't be Queen of Heaven because she's, technically speaking, not the husband of one king, and she's the mother of the second king. So there's no way that's. Do you know what I mean? It's almost as if with some of the sort of changes in culture over the years, because the idea of the Old Testament and the idea of you know, God as a male, Christ coming in male form, it's all been very patriarchal, and of course there's good reason for that. I mean, in that particular historical context, you know, that's what you had to be to make a difference. It's just as it is. Things have changed, and Mary has kind of been used as a sort of female, a balancing of that, I suppose. You know, there is the male worship, but then there is also the honouring of the female as well. So it's an interesting thought, I think. Perhaps this Epiphany we should spend more time wondering about what the life of Joseph might have been like, how he might have felt about the Immaculate Conception, and all that sort of thing. It's interesting because the scriptures do raise certain issues, and you read the issues sometimes and you think, surely the people involved in those issues had feelings and thoughts about what was going on. Did he feel a tiny bit left out? Did he feel, did it impinge in his mind on his masculinity, I suppose, as provider for the family, and yet, Jesus, technically speaking, wasn't his. How did that affect him, I suppose? It's the saying can be said for some of the things in, that go on in the Old Testament. The sacrifice. The sacrifice, Abraham and Isaac, and you have to ask, how did Isaac feel about what Abraham was prepared to do? Was it a case of just, oh well, fine, it's just one of the things my father happened to do when I was little, tie me up, put me on an altar and prepare to sacrifice me, and then change his mind? Would a person that had been through that not sort of also grow up with issues? I don't know, but they are, to me, these are sort of some of the more interesting questions that the scriptures don't really expound on, and you wonder, were people so different back then that it wasn't, or have people always thought and felt sort of like they do now and react to things like they do now? Anyway, that's my Epiphany broadcast for this year.